Good afternoon. Well, that was the easiest applause I've ever got in my life, so that's great. Hey, I'm here to introduce our next guest speaker, but before I do, there's a bit of business to take care of. If you all look at your tickets that you've had coming in, and if you've got a hole punched in your ticket, you've just won a prize. And I have a hole punch for sale, by the way, so if anybody... so visit the giveaway booth on the way out of here. Yeah. So look, it's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our guest speaker. I think it's a very, very relevant topic for Target that Dr. Ramesh Srinivasan is going to speak on, and it's really around inclusivity and designing for inclusivity. You know, when I look at Target and I've come to Target, I think Target does a really good job on diversity and inclusivity in a relative way. So compared to everybody else, I think we do a pretty good job. But I think if you look at an industry in general in America, I think we do a pretty poor job. And that's because there are inherent biases for many, many years in the way we've worked, the way we've recruited, the way we've educated. And if I look in technology in particular, the biases are very, very apparent in that, you know, women are massively underrepresented, and there are certain ethnic groups that are still massively underrepresented in technology, just in the technology organizations. Now, since I've come here, I've made a big priority for my team to address diversity and inclusivity within the tech team. And I think we've done a reasonably good job at recruiting particularly more women into technology by just focusing in and doubling down on recruiting women and going to places where women are educated. But we still have some gaps, and those gaps come about because of the inherent bias, I think, in society. So, you know, we've tended to recruit almost exclusively from what you'd regard as the top universities. And of course, to get into the top universities in America, you have to be relatively well off. So, you know, I think you're massively advantaged if you can afford tutors, if you don't have to work your way through university. That's how you manage to get on, and that is a very, very biased system. So we're beginning to look at ways now of actually recruiting from other sources that are not necessarily the top tier universities, because we realize that that is the only way we can redress the balance and redress the systemic bias in society. So having said that, I think what Ramesh Srinivasan has to say to us today is going to be extraordinarily, I found it in researching the speaker, extraordinarily interesting, and it's about designing for global equality. So this goes beyond the human sphere and then into technology, and how do you design technology that doesn't have necessarily the inherent biases of society, which is generally, let's face it, for technology is white European men. You know, that's where the bias comes from. So how do you overcome those biases, and how do you start designing for inclusivity? So Dr. Srinivasan is an associate professor at UCLA. I won't go through his reams of qualifications, but he makes me feel very, very dumb when I actually read what he's done. He's an author. He's written 2 books and a third about to come out, and he's a very, very well-respected speaker, and has appeared on, you know, numerous programs on TV, etc., commenting on technology. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome Dr. Ramesh Srinivasan to the stage. Thank you.
All right. Hello, Target. How are you? Excellent. Excellent. So before I get started, I wanted to just mention that you can engage with me and the ideas in this talk through Twitter via my handle, which is just up there. I've written a couple books, and I'm working on a third. I'm going to give you some teasers from the third book here, which is a mainstream book looking at what kind of digital future do we want as human beings, what kind of digital future supports our businesses, our cultures, our societies, our values, and so on. I wanted to personally thank your CEO, Brian Cornell, for having me. He's been wonderful to engage with. Also, Mike McNamara, your Chief Information Officer, and of course, Caroline Wanga, your Chief Diversity Officer. I actually was really, really shocked and totally psyched with how down to earth all three were, and really all of you. Every single person I've met today has been really joyful and sweet and really made me feel at home here in Minneapolis. So thank you all for having me. All right. All right. How many of you know who this guy is? All right. This is one Richard Hendricks, who is the lead character, the protagonist of the award-winning television show, which is really funny, sometimes a little too close to home for me, called Silicon Valley, right? And those of you who've watched the show know that what Richard's job is at this point, he's trying to build a company to kind of take the internet back. Bring it back to this place where it really supports decentralization, which is this idea that all of us, no matter who we are, where we are, when we have access to the internet, we have the opportunity to equally and freely express what we believe in outside of censorship. He wanted to get back to that idea of a grassroots network. And this is, kind of a throwback, right, to where the internet was. It was sort of a Wild West type of technology. Kind of was anyone saying anything at any point, and it got a little crazy and weird at times. But at the same time, it spoke to what was powerful about the internet that in many cases other sorts of forms of media and technology never were about. It was the power of people being able to share as they chose, and anyone necessarily, as they chose, really being able to build their own voice, build their own brand, build their own identity online. So this is what Richard is all about. Right now, though, we're at a pretty interesting stage, right? And we're actually at a stage where we are seeing that Wild West of the early internet, where in theory anyone was posting anything, be taken over by a few very, very powerful and useful platforms. But those platforms have obtained such power over everything we do, right? And what's interesting here is we're speaking about some of the wealthiest companies in the history of the world. And in a sense, they're not necessarily producing very much. And they may not even own very much. And they may hire very few people, right? We all know about how Amazon just exceeded over $1 trillion of valuation. Apple is somewhat different than these on the stage, but is also over $1 trillion of valuation. So we are talking about some of the wealthiest companies in the history of our world that are basically building their models as places to go to come together to deal with the wild internet, right? And why was that? It was because all of us, got online, we started posting a lot of information, but then we realized, wait a second, how do we find information? Or how do we connect with one another? And how do we figure out how to buy and sell things? How do we figure out how this might facilitate our engagement to actually use taxis in new ways, right? So the democratization of the internet led to this point where we have this powerful moment today where we see incredible amounts of value and revenue and presence in just a few companies that exist in our world. And that has to be seen relative to some of the big questions that we see across the world and in the United States right now. The top 7 people in our world have an income level or a valuation level that's equivalent to the bottom half of the world's entire population. So think about it. 7 people, 3.5 billion. So that's kind of crazy, right? And it's pretty interesting to see the digital world in relation to these themes. Of course, the digital world is not the cause of these issues, but we have to think about a digital future that's inclusive and balanced given these realities that we see today. To give you a very simple example about this, just a few years ago, you all remember Instagram was sold to Facebook, right? Which also owns WhatsApp. So Instagram was sold with about 14 employees, some say 13, some say 14, for a little over $1 billion. Its valuation is probably at least 10 times that total today, right? So 14 people made approximately $1 billion, but this was within just 3 months of the time when Kodak, with about 35,000 employees, went bankrupt. So we have to think about the macroeconomics and our jobs and our economic livelihoods as we see 14 people make about $1 billion and 35,000 people lose their jobs. So this is important because we're at a point now, today, more than ever, where we're talking about AI, artificial intelligence. Now, I'm kind of an old school AI developer. I was building AI systems about 20 years ago. And at that time, and into graduate school when I was at MIT, whenever we would talk about AI, it seemed kind of like a pipe dream. You know, we just build these models, and it felt almost like a philosophical exercise. We're building AI, but it's sort of a science fiction thing. It's not real. It may not actually have a big impact on our world. But a few things have really changed in our world since the time I was an AI developer about 20 years ago. And what are those things? First of all, we've built faster and faster and faster for cheaper prices computing systems, right? We've had exponential advances in computing processing power. That's one. Two is the amount of data storage has dropped exponentially, right? So the price for a terabyte drive now is exponentially lower than what it might have been just a few years ago. All of us know this, right? And third, and most importantly, are those devices we have in our pockets, right? About 7 billion people in the world, around 6 billion people have mobile phones, and a large percentage of those these days are actually mobile phones that have data associated with them. So if you can imagine 6 billion people constantly releasing data with faster and faster machines that can store almost anything, that's what makes AI a reality. Now the issue here, though, is as we've made these incredible technical advances, which are producing great value for Target and many other companies and all of us across the world, there are some issues here because it's not simply a technological revolution. We have to think socially and culturally alongside with that. And what is the issue here? Well, first of all, who is building these AI systems, right? And we know that's not reflective of necessarily explicit biases, but we do know that the engineering and science fields tend to be mainly male-dominated and often white male-dominated, sometimes Asian males like myself. That's one. Two is as we build AI systems to learn from the world, all that data that's out there on the internet, which is not always pretty, it might actually reflect the biases of our world already, right? So who builds it and what it learns from. And third, and I think most importantly, if we simply build these AI systems privately and we don't even know where they're being built for, what systems are being used in what contexts, and they're not audited, meaning we're not checking what those systems are doing, making sure they don't produce problems, then they can run wild and people can treat them as neutral. And that's a very important issue. So what I want to do is really make a call for a more inclusive engagement as we really think about the future of data, technology, the internet, and more, and build your brand around inclusivity. Build your brand around diversity. Otherwise, we start to see some issues come up. And so these issues I'm going to share. This is the kind of sad part of the talk, and then I'll get to the happy part of the talk. These issues that I'm going to speak about are not necessarily the norm when it comes to AI and algorithmic bias, but we need to be mindful that they do exist so we can figure out ways to head them off, to fend them off before they become real issues. So I'll start with a quite handsome man, most would agree, our former president. And this is a very simple example. This was a technology called FaceApp that was built in St. Petersburg in Russia. And it was kind of like Hot or Not. Any of you remember that? Basically, what that technology did is it would learn from the internet and take people's faces and try to make them more beautiful. Right? It was based on this idea of beautifying faces online. And what it did in this particular case is it turned President Obama's face a little more white. Again, why is that? Because of these issues I mentioned, right? So what we're seeing are biases like this start to emerge as we see technologies travel far and wide, right? And they have everything to do, again, with who's building them, what they're learning from, and whether there's any oversight around them. Okay, second example. Some of you heard about this. This is another troubling example. In some of its image AI recognition systems, its image algorithms, Google's images system had trouble disambiguating, being able to tell the difference between some images of black people, African Americans, and gorillas, right? And this was a big mistake, right? And Google, of course, was not intending on having any of its systems produce such troubling outputs. And it turns out, even relevant for this morning, we've seen some AI systems do the very same thing with images of Serena Williams. So this is a real problem here, right? And Google acknowledges this problem, but it wasn't necessarily, at this point, able to actually interrogate or actually redesign its underlying AI image recognition technology. What it did, as you can see with this slide, is remove gorillas from its image search, which means that the underlying architecture, the underlying learning model upon which these AI systems are based is built upon bias. It's a house of cards, right? So we got to build a new house. That's what we got to do. All right. Now I want to explain how these sorts of projects and these sorts of systems can start to become the norm when they're embedded within institutions in our society without us even knowing about it. Now, how many of you remember the Future Crimes Institute from Minority Report? Right? Tom Cruise movie, right? All right. So in this case, Tom Cruise was talking to, sort of a humanoid, right? But in the AI case and in the real world, right now, right here and now, we are building computational systems to replace judges in certain cases to do courtroom sentencing. And this is happening right now as we speak in Florida. And I want to thank ProPublica for doing this important research. And I want to just explain this project briefly so you know about it. OK. So the man on the left here is an African-American man. The man on the right is a Caucasian-American man. And what we found with this system is even if the man on the right has a prior felony conviction, this system, which predicts the percentage chance or the rate, the possibility of that individual who's apprehended on some crime of engaging in a future crime, predicts much, much higher the African-American man at engaging in the future crime. Does that make sense? So recidivism, which is the rate or the risk of you engaging in a crime again. We're finding with this system, it's called COMPASS, that for African Americans, there's a 77% higher risk of future crimes that cannot be explained by felony convictions. A judge actually analyzing the system said, a guy who has molested a child every day could come out as low risk according to the system. Now that does not, again, just like my previous examples, doesn't mean that the builders of these systems are actually biased or racist or homophobic or any of these things that we don't aspire to be as a society. It means that these systems, again, are learning from the biases of our world. Now, you might think that the way the system would work, it would ask each of these individuals, so they're both apprehended for something small like shoplifting or maybe even jaywalking, who knows, right? Some minor offense. And the system asks these individuals various questions, and it doesn't ask them what their race is. This is the very important point. It does not ask you what your race is. It is supposed to be neutral in that sense. But it asks you questions that are positively correlated, that are linked to one's racial identity, right? I'll give you a couple examples. Was one of your parents or someone in your extended family incarcerated? We know that the rates of incarceration are much, much higher for black and brown people in this country, right? Serena Williams herself was pointing this out this morning in some manner, right? Secondly, it asks you, was one of your parents involved in fights in school, or were you involved in a fight in school? Again, positively correlated with one's racial identity. So we're not asking the right questions because we're not necessarily understanding the fundamental social and cultural and racial bases for building systems in a fair and equitable manner. Now, of course, I get in some arguments with people about this. Not everyone's going to necessarily agree with my position about this. That's wonderful. That's what a democracy is all about. And one of the counter arguments I get when I give these sorts of perspectives is, well, this is better than a racist judge, right? This system at least is data-oriented. It's trying to analyze survey data. It's trying to learn from history in various ways. Often judges may not even pay attention to precedent. To me, that's the wrong question, right? That response, it reflects the wrong question. The question in my mind should be, what kind of digital world do we aspire toward as a society? And how, in your case, how can Target advocate for such a digital world? How can your machine learning systems be built upon equity, building yourselves out as a global brand, building yourselves out as a brand that reaches vulnerable and marginalized people who actually reflect the majority, in many cases, of the population in various parts of our country and of our world? So, I want to give you a couple more slightly dystopic examples, and then I'm going to pivot, all right? All right. This is a project called predictive policing. Some of you have heard of this, of course, and there are science fiction movies about this kind of stuff too, right? Kind of like Minority Report. And this project is called PredPol, short for predictive policing, and it's a system that's being used in 1/3 of precincts right now in Los Angeles, where I live. At the Los Angeles Police Department is using this, right? And what is this system doing? Well, when crimes are documented, or data is collected about crimes, that data is being fed into the system to produce through what's called a partially generative neural network, forget that gobbledygook, to actually make a decision on whether that crime is what's called gang-related or not. All right, so we're trusting a computer to tell us if something's gang-related, and we're taking out the police officer's narrative contextual report on the very same issue, right? And that's a big issue because when, I'll tell you in Los Angeles this is true, I don't know if this is exactly the same way here in Minneapolis, but when something is called gang-related, what the police do in relation to that report is much more severe, right? So the question of what is considered gang-based, what is not considered gang-based, etc., is completely reliant on a computer making those decisions, right? And that's not something necessarily we can do. So obviously, as you can tell, even though this is being implemented in 1/3 of our precincts in our city, people are saying, hey, this is problematic. And one of the junior authors on this paper, which made the rounds recently, his name's Hao Chen, said, hey, I can't answer those questions about ethics and race and so on. I'm just an engineer. So when I say that, a lot of people get upset. How dare he thinks he's just an engineer? I actually don't at all chastise him for that comment. I think what this speaks to is how incredibly interlinked engineering and science and computer science education is with values and ethics and social understanding. I'm a former engineer. I'm a former machine learning person. I realized that to actually build systems to serve people and return value to me and to them, I had to understand the world in a more open manner, right? So we can think about translators between engineering and society as new jobs of the future, and that's a teaser, because I'm going to talk about automation and labor in just a moment. Okay. Now, some of you have heard of perhaps the most controversial system of them all. It's called Recognition. It's an Amazon system. And this system is being sold to military contractors as well as police departments. And what the system is doing, it's cloud-based, is, for example, if I'm a police officer and I have a body camera, I can scan this entire setting. I can figure out what your faces are because the body camera can be linked to cloud-based software that does facial recognition. And I can enter that data in a database that's aggregating data about everything else you've done. So say, for example, you were at a certain protest, or you were at a certain visit, or a certain meeting, or at a certain mall. That data can all be linked and triangulated, right? But what we're seeing, even with this project itself, with this example of the recognition system itself, is it's again creating misidentifications. And now I posted this on Facebook. And a few of my friends kind of snickered. And they said, well, that's because Congress is not that great anyway, right? And I know Congress isn't that popular. I understand that, and that's a bipartisan issue right now. But unfortunately, when we saw the results of this, when you kind of read the story and look at it in some detail and do a little bit of digging, which is what I did, you realize when you look at the system that the error rate, so what it did is it looked at pictures of folks in Congress, and it compared it to its database of mugshots from various police and criminal databases, and it misidentified 5% overall of congressional members, so it made false positive errors with 5%, but with non-white members of Congress, the rate was about 40%. So that's the problem here. Again, Again and again and again, we're seeing the same issue, which is something we can do something about right now. We're at an inflection point when it comes to digital technology where we collectively can take power over technology to ensure that these kinds of outcomes do not occur. We're in very, very baby stages with this, just like we were in baby stages, initial stages with the internet, just a couple decades ago. Okay, couple other examples, and then I'm going to kind of share some insights into what we can do about this. As you all know, AI systems are not just kind of engaging with these questions of race and so on, but they're also being embedded in the future of work, right? Many forms of work, I wouldn't necessarily be directly supplanted, but various forms of work are either going to be changed or might be obsolete when it comes to human beings doing those tasks in the next 20 years or so. This is something that is widely concluded upon. Some people even say about 40% of jobs, as they are today, are going to change or not exist in the next 20 years. Those are some studies, right? And one of these systems, an AI system, is being built to replace various forms of human resources labor, right? So sometimes if you want to work at a great company like Target, or when we get applications for professor positions at UCLA, we'll get like 300 applications, 300 CVs, right? Like your resumes for one job. Right? And so the hardest part of that process is winnowing down from 300 to like your 5 finalists or your 10 finalists, right? So what's happening is a system called word embedding, it's another algorithmic technique, is being used to scan CVs and make decisions around which of those 300 will make the final 5, right? The problem is we're finding out for science and technology jobs, there are massive 50+% bias rates for CVs that are more or less identical, went to the same schools, same scores, same recommendations, blah, 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 for men against women versus women. So 50% of equally qualified women by these AI systems for human resources are being excluded from that cut. And that's because those CVs are able to inductively figure out that these are women's CVs and are associating those words in the CVs with words that are not seen as scientific, like happy or soft, which is really, really strange. So again, it's learning from the biases of our world and actually naturalizing it, right? It's embedding it in a technological future that we just treat as neutral if we are not aware that these things are even existing. So that's why we got to do something about it, and we can. All right. So as you know, asymmetric questions of a lack of understanding and comprehension and literacy and power over our data can create some very strange outcomes, right? And so one of them, which I think all of you know about, that became very famous and that I spoke about on Morning Joe just in February, right after the inauguration of President Trump in 2018, is the example of Cambridge Analytica. Right? And this is not about Trump. This group, Cambridge Analytica, has worked for the Kenyan government, the Mexican government, worked for the Ted Cruz campaign, and so on. But it's important that you all understand what Analytica comes from, right? It's not necessarily the exception. It's actually just an example, like many others could be examples, of what's going on with personal data and how it can influence political outcomes. Now, what Analytica did is it worked with what are called psychometric models. So the Obama campaign in 2008, I talked to David Axelrod about this for my new book, worked with our personal data and was able to demographically micro-target the voting public based on kind of not just your racial demographic, voting demographic, neighborhood demographic, economic demographic, and so on. So that campaign knew that I was a 40-year-old Indian American. What Analytica knew was that I was a 40-year-old Indian American who's neurotic at this time of the day, who's open at these other times of the day, right? So this was based on a much more finely granular model that tried to map psycho and demographic states to data traces, or what we call digital footprints, right? And that's what actually really took it to another level, because what Analytica did was not simply feed you stories based on your psychological condition, but would even feed you content to influence you potentially to not vote at all, based on who you are psychologically. And this builds upon research, and this is Alexander Nix, the former CEO of Cambridge Analytica, who I managed to get a quick interview in with before the whole company folded, thanks to the Mexican government. And this all builds on research that's done by a professor at Stanford, who you might have heard of his work. His name is Michal Kosinski, and he is actually the subject of that first story that Vice posted about Cambridge Analytica, which came out a long time ago, right? Right when things were starting to come out about Analytica. And what Kosinski says, and some of you have heard about this work, is with 10 Facebook likes, and it doesn't have to be Facebook, it could be any digital footprint, 10 Facebook likes, I can know you better than one of your colleagues, right? Think about the person sitting next to you. 10 Facebook likes is sufficient to know you better, to make predictions about you and your behavior and even your psychological state more than the person sitting next to you. With 70, I can know you better than a friend. With 150, I can know you better than a family member. And with 300, I can know you better than your spouse. All right. Kosinski's work is obviously a little bit provocative. And he's also done research, which you might have heard of, where he can make predictions simply by looking at digital footprints in people's faces about one's sexuality as well. And so I invited him to come and give a talk in my department, and people were like, a lot of my students were like a little concerned about all this. And Kosinski made the point, it's not me that is necessarily the issue here. The stuff I'm exposing can be used and built out in a far more sophisticated fashion by governments or anyone really across the world who has the capacity, has the infrastructure, has the technology to do so. So this is really important because if you actually think about it, who you are on Facebook or Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, as I said, or WhatsApp, right? Who you are on Facebook may not necessarily be who you are, right? Most of my pictures on Facebook are of me smiling. Trust me, I don't smile all the time. I want to, right? So we present a particular subset, a curated sense of self when we are on Facebook. But think about other digital footprints you have, right? Like where you go, who you talk to, what we call metadata. Or we can even think about digital footprints related to your credit card transactions, which, by the way, I could buy, and Cambridge Analytica did, for all of you. And what happens if I can cross-reference, or we call aggregate, your digital footprint data related to your credit cards with your Facebook data? I can build a whole other kind of set of, I can understand you in a cross-referential way. Does that make sense? I don't simply understand you by how you wish to present yourself, but what you actually buy and do and where you go, right? So that is, I think, an extremely powerful point that we can't see our technological engagements in a silo. We have to look across them. Now, this, of course, is not the only way we can think about technology in relation to political campaigns, right? And another example, which is kind of an old school example, it's kind of a throwback to the internet of about 10 to 15 years ago, was the crowdsourcing model, right? Is that still a term we use, crowdsourcing? No, I got a bunch of shaking heads. Crowdsourcing is the idea like we can all come together, right? And so this was like the whole $27, right? Like each person gives $27 as an average amount, and you can actually raise a significant amount of money and avoid taking any super PAC money, right? And that was what this campaign attempted to do through its use of the internet and digital technology. And we've seen this from campaigns from the right and the left and the center, right? But what's interesting about this particular slide that I choose to show is there's one character in this picture you may not have noticed. It's really cute. It's a birdie that landed on the podium here, right? Do y'all remember Bernie Sanders was trending on Twitter? Yeah, a bunch of you remember that. Cool. And that was really interesting. So in this book, right after the Analytica section, I'm writing about the Sanders campaign, about how it is they took these various moments and made them go viral, right? And that's something still that we see as a very powerful aspect of the internet, that somehow, some way, if we have the right kind of intelligence and acumen, we can take just our own voice, our own video. I was talking to Bo Burnham, the comedian, about this just a couple days ago, and really get our stuff to go viral, right? And Bernie Sanders went viral because there was a photographer literally 10 feet away, and that photographer had a Twitter account, And they figured out a way to quickly link and get this thing into the digital infrastructure and make it go viral. So this is one side of what we see can happen, right? You can take the local, you can take the grassroots, you can take a personal or a people's-based issue and make it the new normal online. Now, what I want to do now is kind of talk about where we're heading with tech in relation to economics, which I touched on earlier, right? So as I mentioned, about 40% of jobs, some people say 20 to 40%, might be automated in some fashion. This does not mean it's a zero-sum game. It might be people working with technology, but we have to identify what those new jobs are. And this is a story that was on the front page of the New York Times that was discussing what are called work councils, right? So we see automation starting to take effect, you know, self-driving cars, other kinds of self-driving, even these human resources algorithms or other forms of automation. And we also see the kind of intermediate stage of automation with the gig economy, right? People on 1099s who are driving for Uber, driving for Lyft, and so on, right? And these are also sort of intermediate stages toward automation, because in many cases what these people are doing who are doing gig economy jobs are training potential automated systems into the future. So how do we prepare for automation in a way that recognizes and supports ultimately what we care about, which is like human beings, right? And our businesses and our brands and our communities and our cultures, which you all clearly have. I could really feel that today. And what this example was talking about was called worker reskilling. And this is actually something that's not just in Sweden. I know Sweden might be maybe a little more similar to Minnesota than where I live. You know, we're further north. But at the same time, this is something that even in the United States, the company AT&T has been attempting to do, that my colleague Thomas Friedman from the New York Times wrote about. I had a conversation with him about this very issue, which is how do we get creative about this? We understand that automation and AI systems, hopefully they're going to be better and better and better and more inclusive, are the wave of the future. How do we ensure that what we do in light of those systems is make sure human beings are protected, that we have creative, dignified work that allows us to work with machines? I already identified the idea of an ethics translator as one job, right? So what is happening in Sweden, what AT&T has been doing, and other kinds of organizations is trying to get ahead of the curve, right? Like, let's think 5 years ahead. Let's think 10 years ahead. Let's think about these digital trends and make sure we're ready for the future and ensure that we protect our people and our community rather than cutting them loose and thinking the machines will do everything. That might just be a dystopic sci-fi vision, not something we have to accept if we choose not to. So that, I think, is really a key issue. And so that's part of what I'm writing about right now. How do we get there? What kinds of worker reskilling programs are there out there? What kinds of new jobs might we start to identify into the future? But the other part of this, and this is Michael Tubbs, who I met at TED about 7 or 8 years ago. He's the mayor of Stockton. He's 27 years old. He's the youngest mayor of a city, Stockton again, that's 100,000 people or larger, Rhodes Scholar, single-family home, first black mayor of Stockton, and is making the rounds for experimenting with ideas of a more inclusive future. And one of the ideas that Michael's been talking about, and I just interviewed him recently, is the idea of what we call a universal basic income. And another idea related to it is a portable benefits package, right? So if I work for Uber 8 hours a week, if I work for TaskRabbit 10 hours a week, if I work doing something else for 20 hours a week, let's get them all to pool together to make sure that I'm protected in terms of health insurance, which is increasingly popular amongst the American public, right? So what Michael's also been looking at is the simple idea of giving people a little bit of money, which is a bipartisan agreement, believe it or not, right? Giving people a little bit of money each month and seeing what they do with that money. Can we protect people as we engage in these inflections into a digital future? Because we're at an incredibly important transition point, as we have been many other times in our history. So I've been speaking about this and thinking about this, and this is another idea that I encourage you all to think about as well. Now, what I want to do is shift to what a lot of my work is concerned about, and my first book was really about, which is a global look at all of this, right? Target's a global company. It's not just an American company. You work all over the world. I heard from your CEO today about how you all work in countries like India and so on. Now, when we think globally, right, the internet might seem flat. It might seem like everyone everywhere has great internet. It's not true. I've worked in 40 different countries across the world. I've visited about 80 countries in the world. It's like the most fun thing ever, by the way. Sometimes on the back of donkey carts, writing notes, and then eventually trying to figure out how I'm going to get it up on the cloud, right? And what we find is even the internet itself, the very backbone of the internet. How do people get internet? Well, primarily it's through satellite and this, fiber optic cables. And the fiber optic cables that are the infrastructural backbone of the internet itself are based upon relationships of power and inequality and asymmetry. Look at these cables. Do you all see them? Right? Spanning the ocean, right? You see these cables look like catching flights, right? So look at the continent of Africa and the continent of South America. There are only two major cables connecting those two parts of the world to one another, the two most populous continents of the global south, right? And Nairobi, which is connected by several cables, either across and within Africa, like down the coast, or to other continents, to South America. Nairobi is the capital of Kenya, which Caroline is a proud Kenyan. and Nairobi, as a result of this better connectivity than most in Africa, has a thriving technology community, right? So access is not sort of this one size fits all. It's not equal for everybody. Even the ways we connect the world through fiber optic cables, through the internet itself, reflects these relationships, right? Like look at how many cables are going from Los Angeles, where I live, or San Francisco, where I'm from, to East Asia, to Hong Kong, to Japan, to Shanghai, right? Look at how many cables are connecting New York City and London because of the financial markets, right? Computing's not immaterial, it's infrastructural, right? So you can actually see these real-life connections around how power functions in the world through the infrastructures of the internet itself. So these are some of the issues that I was dealing with my first book, that I was thinking about with my first book. Look how awesome the cover is of this book. And the press sent me like an initial cover of the book, and it was like old school stencil art. It was like a planet with like a axis around it, and I was like, this is not going to work. Let's make this like more hip looking. So this is the cover. These are some of the issues. The global side of things are really issues I was dealing with in my first book, Whose Global Village. This new book might be called Beyond the Valley. I'm not sure yet, but we're going to figure it out. And what that book looks at are issues that have now come to become very, very mainstream, right? I talked about some of these issues of bias and algorithms and AI systems already, but if you even look at different parts of the world, and even our country itself, people are getting their news through platforms like Facebook. And this is not just true in the United States. This is also true in countries like Sri Lanka, in Myanmar, in the Philippines, in India, and so on, right? And part of the reason why is because there's an absence of trust in classical institutions, in some cases for good reason. And we see that right now in the political system here as well. And the reason why there's an absence of trust is people feel these are for elites, right? Not for the common man, not for the working class. So what's a better idea than that? Well, log on to Facebook and see like what, Caroline's my friend, maybe your CEO's my friend on Facebook, and let's see what they post because I trust them, right? The problem is, what is visible to us on these platforms, especially in cases where there aren't strong media institutions, and even in this country where people have a distrust of media institutions, might be rumors. It might not be true. It might be, dare I say it, fake news. Don't quote me on that one. So this, there are examples like this that we can see almost every day when we look at like newspapers like the New York Times. And this is an example of how rumors about the ethnic Muslim minority in Sri Lanka being up to some bad things ended up becoming what was trending when people logged onto Facebook. And that ended up shaping what people actually thought was the truth. And then as a result, they engaged in violence and burning and arson against these people, against these vulnerable minorities, right? And we've seen examples of this again and again and again. This is what Russia did with their election, right? This is what we've seen happen right after the Las Vegas shooting. You'll unfortunately remember that, right? Where what we saw trending on Google News, on YouTube, on Facebook, I think briefly even on Twitter, was that shooter was a Rachel Maddow show viewer. So what happens here? Why does this happen? Well, these algorithms that are making that are determining what is or is not visible are based upon what will keep your attention, right? Because what do these companies want? It doesn't mean they're bad, like a TV station. They just want you to look at them, right? Because the more you look at it, the more data they can get. The more data they get, the more stuff you can be sold. Data is oil. It is the oil of the digital economy, right? And the digital economy is certainly powerful. So the problem here is these recommendation systems and these algorithms are just simply, it's not a human that's biased, it's these systems saying what is going to keep someone's attention. And we know that human beings, because of our dopamine, we like to see those numbers on the top right of Facebook, we like to see those retweets, we like to see those likes, right? Because of the dopamine that is part of our lower brainstem that triggers, that shoots off. And we know that dopamine's not the only thing that's good for us, right? And so as a result, sometimes rumors and misinformation can become the new normal. They can be the accepted norm, rather than content that is vetted, that's pluralistic, that's diverse, that's humane, right? And so that is really, really important. And I did some experiments looking at this, like a bunch of my colleagues, where I would watch Make America Great Again rallies on the one hand, but then I would also watch Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders rallies on the other hand, and I'd look at what those systems would recommend to me, what they would recommend that I see after that video. How many of you have done that? YouTube recommendations. You just kind of watch a YouTube video and you just wait for the next thing, right? Like a bunch of you? Right? And what it wasn't Make America Great Again with another Make America Great Again rally, or it wasn't Bernie Sanders rally with another Bernie Sanders rally. It would choose and select often more extreme and radical content. So neo-Nazi stuff after Make America Great Again, or like hyper-communist stuff after the Bernie Sanders content, right? And what that means is radicalism is a great way of keeping someone's attention. And that is really bad for our democracy. That's really bad for us as a society, because we're coming apart at the seams as a result, because these systems are internally optimized. So this is why I wrote this piece for Quartz. I have a lot of love for Silicon Valley. I'm from there. I gave a talk about these very issues at Google. People were agreeing with me at this talk, right? I recently gave a talk at Twitter, etc. So that is, but it's really like a challenge for all of us to come together and work on these issues. And I give this point in this piece I wrote for Quartz right after my first book came out, of being invited to go to the country of Cameroon, searching for Cameroon online on Google, and realizing that 90+% of the sites that were retrieved on page 1 were not from Cameroon itself. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that Google is anti-Cameroon. It meant that I had no choices to optimize my search in a way that fit me. And I thought Google would know that I'm like this, hippie traveler guy who like goes all over the world and wants to learn from different cultures and so on, right? But actually, Cameroon, believe it or not, has a very active blogosphere. There are lots of people online in Cameroon, lots of people with really cool websites, English language websites, French language websites, and so on. But the only website that had any kind of more local content from Cameroon on page 1, remember 95% of the time we don't get to page 2 of our Google search results, right? And 70% of the time we don't get past the first 3 search results. So the only page that had some local content was Wikipedia. And that's great, Wikipedia is awesome. But then I looked kind of under the cover a little bit further and found about 95% of Wikipedia edited content, at least on certain sites, was not edited from that country itself. It tended to be more male and Caucasian again. So again, this goal of kind of creating more inclusivity in authorship and literacy is not, again, Wikipedia's fault. It's not any of our fault. It's just something we need to strive toward, and it reflects the gaps and inequalities and how the internet has arrived to different parts of the world. So I give a bunch of examples that I want to share with you that are really like heartwarming for me and like exciting for me, and they really give me a lot of inspiration. I'm really positive about where we're going with the digital world, and getting a chance to engage with all of you increases that like love and excitement that I have. And in the book, I talk about this example. So quite a bit of the first book, the Who's Global Village book, is work I do like basically living and working with different communities in different parts of the world. So I did a lot of work in South in South India. I did quite a bit of work in the Arab world, a lot of work in Latin America. And this is stuff I did here in the United States with Native American communities. And this was related to this theme of cultural heritage, right? Like, how do people use technologies to preserve their histories and their heritages and their identities? And this is a group of folks at Zuni, which is a Native American community in New Mexico. I know here in Minnesota there are several Native communities, right? This is an incredible image, and I have it in the book. This is how the Zuni used technology. And what we were doing was building a system where they could use technology to get access to images of objects that were excavated from their communities that are sitting in museums all over the world, right? So thousands and thousands of images of objects that were taken from the communities that are sitting in museums, the British Museum, Brooklyn Museum, maybe here at the Walker Art Center, you know? There are these images of these objects. Let's get them back to these people so these folks can have access to this at the minimum, and even maybe help work with the museums to figure out ways so the museums can properly tell the stories behind these objects. But what happens here is this is the way the Zuni engage with this process. Sometimes it's 15 people, sometimes it's 20 people, sometimes it's 10 people, but they all look at it together. It's a collective use of technology. Why is that important? Well, at Zuni, like a lot of other cultures across the world, knowledge is not just in your head as an individual. It exists collectively. It exists in your community, right? And so as people were looking at images, I noticed at times people would put their fingers in their ears. It's so weird, right? Some people would leave the room. Other people would come in. They would change the languages they would speak multiple times. And why is that? Well, because who you are in this community determines what you can say and what you know and what you can share. It has everything to do with your bloodline, you know, like matrilineal, patrilineal lines, you know, your initiation in a society. Even the languages you speak are very important because some of that knowledge can only be expressed in your own indigenous language and not otherwise. Because language itself is a reflection into who we are and our identities. So this is really cool. Like when you see this in action, you're like, wait a second, that's a whole other vision. Like back at MIT, we were working on the one laptop per child, or what some people call the $100 laptop. And it's kind of old school, but some of you might remember this. And I was thinking about how this might be something different, a different way of thinking about technology. So with that in mind, I've been hanging out and working in southern Mexico, telling out new stories that are going to be in this new book. So that's also going to be in the book, right? And this is in the southern Mexican region of Oaxaca, which is one of the most biodiverse and linguistically diverse places in the world. And this is with people of Zapotec descent. Zapotec is the name of the indigenous community. And what are these guys doing? Well, they live in these communities. They're farmers. A lot of folks from these communities live in Los Angeles and other parts of the United States. And they really, really want mobile phone services for obvious reasons. They want to figure out how to sell their crops. They want to keep in touch with their relatives. They want to organize things even on their lands because they're spread out across the mountains, right? They want to figure this out. So mobile phones are really important. But the cell phone companies, including Telcel, which is run by Carlos Slim, one of the wealthiest people in the world, said, hey, we don't want to provide you service because you guys are in mountains, it's raining all the time, there aren't enough of you, and you're not rich enough. So what did this community do? They built it themselves. They said, we can build a cell phone network that we own collectively. And this is another vision of technology, right? Like you can build technology in this way. We have the possibility of layering our values and principles and ideals onto how we build technology. That's really my point in this talk, again and again and again. So what we have here is the largest community-owned cell phone network in the world. It's making people money, it's empowering businesses, it's empowering economic development. And so this is a project that I've been writing about also, and it's really incredible for me to like listen to and learn from people's stories of technological innovation. And I want to make that point as I kind of close this talk in the next few minutes. This is not something that's simply happening in Oaxaca, right? Like you might be like, well, that's really far away. This is also happening in Detroit. This is also happening in Red Hook, and so on. Some of the poorest and most vulnerable communities in our society realize that they can take power over their own digital technologies. And so what's happening in Detroit right now as we speak is communities in Detroit, I don't need to tell the story of Detroit, I think all of you know it, have built their own digital networks using what we call mesh network technology. And what are they doing? They're building their own intranet and internet networks. And what they're doing through the process is it's not even about the technology, it's the process of creating and designing it is allowing them to engage and get access to new skills that can really help them be marketable, find jobs, build businesses, empower schools, and so on, right? This allows these people to become part of the global digital economy, right? To access wealth. And these communities said, hey, if you're not going to serve us with internet, we'll do it ourselves, right? And this is really important in light of some of the discussions around net neutrality, which I've been on MSNBC talking about a few times with Joy Reid. And you know, these are issues that I think we need to think about, not because we have to take positions on good or bad net neutrality, but we need to give people opportunities to have the kind of internet that they want to have. All right. So I want to end with perhaps the coolest example of all. This is a 3D printer. Do you all kind of recognize 3D printers? Do any of you have 3D printers? Oh yeah, cool, awesome. So one of you at least. And this, you might say, okay, 3D printer, we can all get a 3D printer, we can buy a 3D printer. People are increasingly gonna have 3D printers. But this is a 3D printer made primarily out of recycled parts, literally dumpster diving, in Nairobi, in Kenya. They are building their own technologies, incubating their own industries, and thriving in Kenya. And this is not just in Kenya, this is happening in Lagos, in Accra, in Ghana, where Google has just set up a big AI lab, to their credit, right? This is happening in places like that. These are new sites of technological innovation, right? Which basically means we often think about terms that we take for granted when we think about the digital world, like innovation and disruption. And definitely we need to give the pioneers of the digital world, right? Sergey and Larry, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, of course. We have to give them a lot of credit. Sure, they were innovators, absolutely. They were brilliant, they were geniuses. But this is also innovation. Innovation also happens when you have less, because you gotta hustle, you gotta rig things, right? When you have constraints, you can innovate, right? Innovation also happens in relation to the spirit of resourcefulness, of being creative, realizing that you got to do what you got to do. And literally, I've seen this all over the world, but a lot in East Africa, what they call in Swahili, jua kali. Did I pronounce it correctly? and jua kali literally means hot sun, right? And what does that mean? You sometimes see in places in Nairobi, in other parts of the world, across the world, even I see it in Los Angeles, people with a soldering gun, a table, sitting in the sun. And what they're doing literally is rewiring phones, extending the lifespan of technologies, taking things that might be seen as planned obsolescence by Apple and actually building new forms of value. They're creating new technologies out of the constraints that they see because it's affordable, because it's cheaper, because this is a matter of survival. And I think that's really, really powerful to see how street-level entrepreneurs and business people can create technologies like this. This technology is much more resilient than buying a technology from the United States or China and importing it there, because it's optimized for the local economic conditions. It's optimized for the local markets. Can we not think similarly when it comes to target products in the global south, right? This is an example of what I think of as extremely creative forms of ingenuity. So these are stories that I'm telling in this new book, right? And I think it's really, really so much fun for me to talk about this stuff and think about this. I learn a lot from talking to any of you, so please tweet at me about these issues. I think we're at a really powerful inflection point, right? Like a point of transition, as we've had a couple times previously, and I'm writing about that also in relation to blockchain, in relation to this new book. We're at a powerful point where we have the power to design our digital future, and you all work at a very powerful company, so you have the power to do this too. Join me in thinking about a more inclusive digital future that supports us all, that allows Target to continue to stand for the values that it so clearly stands for into the new technology world. Thank you so much.